Relax and listen to the voice. The Shepherd Boy. There was once upon a time a shepherd boy whose fame spread far and wide because of the wise answers which he gave to every question. The king of the country heard of it likewise, but did not believe it, and sent for the boy. Then he said to him, "If you could give me an answer to 3 questions which I will ask you, I will look on you as my own child, and you shall dwell with me in my royal palace." The boy said, "What are the 3 questions?" The king said, "The first is, how many drops of water are there in the ocean?" The shepherd boy answered, "Lord King, if you will have all the rivers on earth dammed up so that not a single drop runs from them into the sea until I have counted it, I will tell you how many drops there are in the sea." The king said, "The next question is, how many stars are there in the sky?" The shepherd boy said, "Give me a great sheet of white paper." And then he made so many fine points on it with the pen that they could scarcely be seen, and it was all but impossible to count them. Anyone who looked at them would have lost his sight. And then he said, "There are as many stars in the sky as there are points on the paper. Just count them." But no one was able to do it. The king said, "The third question is, how many seconds of time are there in an eternity?" And then said the shepherd boy, "In Lower Pomerania is the Diamond Mountain, which is 2 miles high, 2 miles wide, and 2 miles deep. Every 100 years a little bird comes and sharpens its beak on it, and when the whole mountain is worn away by this, then the first second of eternity will be over." The king said, "You have answered the 3 questions like a wise man, and shall henceforth dwell with me in my royal palace, and I will regard you as my own child." The Star Money. There was once upon a time a little girl whose father and mother were dead, and she was so poor that she no longer had a room to live in or a bed to sleep in, and at last she had nothing else but the clothes she was wearing and a little bit of bread in her hand which some charitable soul had given to her. She was good and pious, however, and as she was thus forsaken by all the world, she went forth into the open country, trusting in the good God. Then a poor man met her, who said, "Ah, give me something to eat. I am so hungry." She handed him the whole of her piece of bread and said, "May God bless you," and went onwards. Then came a child who moaned and said, "My head is so cold. Give me something to cover it with." So she took off her hood and gave it to him. And when she had walked a little further, she met another child who had no jacket and was frozen with cold. Then she gave the child her own jacket, and a little further on, one begged for a frock, and she gave away that also. At length she got into the forest, and it had already become dark, and there came yet another child, and asked for a shirt. And the good little girl thought to herself, "It is a dark night, and no one sees you. You can very well give your shirt away." And she took it off, and she gave away that also. And as she so stood, and had not one single thing left, suddenly some stars from heaven fell down, and they were nothing else but hard, smooth pieces of money. And although she had just given her shirt away, she had a new one, which was of the very finest linen. Then she put the money into it, and was rich all the days of her life. The Stolen Farthings. A father was one day sitting at dinner with his wife and his children, and a few good friends who had come to visit ate with them. And as they thus sat, and it was striking 12 o'clock, a friend saw the door open, and a very pale child dressed in snow-white clothes came in. It did not look around, and it did not speak, but went straight into the next room. Soon afterwards it came back, and went out the door again in the same quiet manner. On the second and the third day, it came also exactly in the same way. At last, the friend asked the father to whom the beautiful child that went into the next room every day at noon belonged. "I have never seen it," said he. Neither did he know to whom it could belong. The next day, when it again came, the stranger pointed it out to the father, who, however, still did not see it, and the mother and the children also saw nothing. At this, the friend got up, went to the room door, opened it a little, and peeped in. Then he saw the child sitting on the ground and busily digging and seeking about between the boards of the floor, but when it saw the stranger, it disappeared. He now told what he had seen and described the child exactly, and the mother recognized it and said, "Ah, it is my dear child who died a month ago." They took up the boards and found 2 farthings which the child had once received from its mother, that it might give them to a poor man. It, however, had thought, "You can buy yourself a biscuit for that," and had kept the farthings and hidden them in the openings between the boards. And therefore it had had no rest in its grave, and had come every day at noon to seek for these farthings. The parents gave the money at once to a poor man, and after that the child was never seen again. Brides on their trail. There was once a young shepherd who wanted very much to marry, and was acquainted with 3 sisters who were all equally pretty, so that it was difficult for him to make a choice, and he could not decide to give the preference to any one of them. Then he asked his mother for advice, and she said, "Invite all 3, and set some cheese before them, and watch how they eat it." The youth did so. The first swallowed the cheese with the rind on. The second hastily cut the rind off of the cheese, but she cut it so quickly that she left much good cheese with it, and threw that away also. And the third peeled the rind off carefully, and cut neither too much nor too little. The shepherd told all of this to his mother, who said, "Take the third for your wife." This he did, and he lived contentedly and happily with her. The Sparrow and his 4 children. A sparrow had 4 young ones in a swallow's nest. When they were fledged, some naughty boys pulled out the nest, but fortunately all of the birds got safely away in the high wind. Then the old bird was grieved that his sons had all gone out into the world. He had not first warned them of every kind of danger, and had not given them good instruction on how to deal with each. In the autumn, a great many sparrows assembled together in a wheat field, and there the old bird met his 4 children again, and full of joy took them home with him. "Ah, my dear sons, how I have been worrying about you all through the summer, because you got away in the wind without my teaching. Listen to my words, obey your father, and be well on your guard. Little birds have to encounter great dangers." And then he asked the eldest where he had spent the summer, and how he had supported himself. "I stayed in the gardens, and looked for caterpillars and small worms until the cherries were ripe." "Ah, my son," said the father, "titbits are not bad, but there is a great risk about them. On that account, take great care of yourself henceforth, and particularly when people are going about the gardens who carry long green poles which are hollow inside and have a little hole at the top." "Yes, father, but what if a little green leaf is stuck over the hole with wax?" said the son. "Where have you seen that?" "In a merchant's garden," said the youngster. "Oh, my son, merchant folks are smart folks," said the father. "If you have been among the children of this world, you have learned worldly craftiness enough. Only see that you use it well, and do not be too confident." And then he asked the next, "Where have you passed your time?" "At court," said the son. "Sparrows and silly little birds are of no use in that place. There one finds much gold, velvet, silk, armor, harnesses, sparrowhawks, screech owls, and lanners. Keep to the horses and stables, where they winnow oats or thresh, and then fortune may give you your daily grain of corn in peace."
"Yes, father," said the son, "but when the stable boys make traps and fix their gins and snares in the straw, many a one is caught."
"Where have you seen that?" said the old bird.
"At court, among the stable boys."
"Oh, my son, court boys are bad boys. If you have been to court and among the lords and have left no feathers there, you have learnt a fair amount, and you will know very well how to go about the world. But look around you and above you, for the wolves often devour the wisest dogs." The father examined the third also. "Where did you seek your fortune?" "I have cast my tub and rope on the cart roads and highways, and sometimes met with a grain of corn or barley." "That indeed is dainty fare," said the father. "But take care what you are about, and look carefully around, especially when you see anyone stooping and about to pick up a stone, for then you have not much time to waste." "That is true," said the son. "But what if anyone should carry a bit of rock or ore ready beforehand in his breast or pocket?" "Where have you seen that?" "Among the miners, my dear father. When they get out of the pit, they generally take a little bits of ore with them. Mining folks are working folks, and therefore clever folks." "If you have been among mining lads, you have seen and learnt something, but when you go thither, beware, for many a sparrow has been brought to a bad end by a mining boy throwing a piece of cobalt." At length the father came to the youngest son. "You, my dear, chirping, nestling, were always the silliest and weakest. Stay with me. The world has many rough, wicked birds which have crooked beaks and long claws, and they lie in wait for poor little birds and swallow them. Keep with those of your own kind, and pick up little spiders and caterpillars from the trees or the houses, and then you will live long in peace."
"My dear father, he who feeds himself without injury to other people fares well, and no sparrowhawk, eagle, or kite will hurt him if he commits himself in his lawful food, evening and morning, faithfully to God, who is the creator and preserver of all forest and village birds, who likewise heareth the cry and prayer of the young ravens. For no sparrow or wren ever falls to the ground except by his will."
"Where have you learnt this?" The son answered.
"When the great blast of wind tore me away from you, I came to a church, and there during the summer I have picked up the flies and spiders from the windows, and heard this discourse preached. The father of all the sparrows fed me all the summer through, and kept me from all misfortune and from ferocious birds."
"Indeed, my dear son, if you take refuge in the church, and help to clear away spiders and buzzing flies, and chirp unto God like the young ravens, and commend yourself to the eternal Creator, all will be well with you, and that even if the whole world were full of wild, malicious birds. He who to God commits his ways, in silence suffers, waits and prays, perseveres his faith, and conscience pure, he is of God's protection sure." Snow White and Rose Red. There was once a poor widow who lived in a lonely cottage. In front of the cottage was a garden wherein stood 2 rose trees, one of which bore white and the other red roses. She had 2 children who were like the 2 rose trees, and one was called Snow White and the other Rose Red. They were as good and happy, as busy and cheerful as ever 2 children in the world were, only Snow White was more quiet and gentle than Rose Red. Rose Red liked better to run about in the meadows and fields seeking flowers and catching butterflies, but Snow White sat at home with her mother and helped her with her housework, or read to her when there was nothing to do. The 2 children were so fond of one another that they always held each other by the hand when they went out together. And when Snow White said, "We will not leave each other," Rose Red answered, "Never so long as we live." And their mother would add, "What one has she must share with the other." They often ran about the forest alone and gathered red berries, and no beast did them any harm, but came close to them trustfully. The little hare would eat a cabbage leaf out of their hands. The roe grazed by their side. The stag leapt merrily by them, and the birds sat still upon the boughs, and sang whatever they knew. No mishap overtook them. If they had stayed too late in the forest and night came on, they laid themselves down near one another upon the moss, and slept until morning came, and their mother knew this and did not worry on their account. Once, when they had spent the night in the wood and the dawn had roused them, they saw a beautiful child in a shining white dress sitting near their bed. He got up and looked quite kindly at them, but said nothing, and went away into the forest. And when they looked around, they found that they had been sleeping quite close to a precipice, and would certainly have fallen off into the darkness if they had only gone a few paces further. And their mother told them that it must have been an angel who watches over all good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's little cottage so neat that it was a pleasure to look inside of it. In the summer, Rose Red took care of the house, and every morning laid a wreath of flowers by her mother's bed before she awoke, in which was a rose from each tree. In the winter, Snow White lit the fire and hung the kettle on the hob. The kettle was of brass and shone like gold, so brightly it was polished. In the evening, when the snowflakes fell, the mother said, "Go, Snow White, and bolt the door." And then they all sat around the hearth, and the mother took her spectacles and read aloud out of a large book, and the two girls listened as they sat and spun. And close by them lay a lamb upon the floor, and behind them upon a perch sat a white dove with its head hidden beneath its wings. One evening, as they were thus sitting comfortably together, someone knocked at the door as if he had wished to be let in. The mother said, "Quick, Rose Red, open the door. It must be a traveler who is seeking shelter." Rose Red went and pushed back the bolt, thinking that it was a poor man, but it was not. It was a bear that stretched its broad black head within the door. Rose Red screamed and sprang back. The lamb bleated, the dove fluttered, and Snow White hid herself behind her mother's bed. But the bear began to speak and said, "Do not be afraid. I will do you no harm. I am half frozen, and I only want to warm myself a little beside you." "Poor bear," said the mother. "Lie down by the fire. Only take care that you do not burn your coat." And then she cried, "Snow White, Rose Red, come out. The bear will do you no harm. He means well." So they both came out. By and by the lamb and dove came nearer, and were not afraid of him. The bear said, "Here, children, knock the snow out of my coat a little." So they brought the broom and swept the bear's hide clean, and he stretched himself by the fire and growled contentedly and comfortably. It was not long before they grew quite at home and played tricks with their clumsy guest. They tugged his hair with their hands, put their feet upon his back and rolled him about, or they took a hazel switch and beat him, and when he growled they laughed. But the bear took it all in good part. Only when they were too rough he called out, "Leave me alive, children. Snow White, Rose Red, will you beat your wooer dead?" When it was bedtime and the others went to bed, the mother said to the bear, "You can lie there by the hearth, and then you will be safe from the cold and the bad weather." As soon as day had dawned, the two children let him out, and he trotted across the snow into the forest. Henceforth the bear came every evening at the same time, laid himself down by the hearth, and let the children amuse themselves with him just as much as they had liked. And they had gotten so used to him that the doors were never fastened until their black friend had arrived. When spring had come and all outside was green, the bear said one morning to Snow White, "Now I must go away, and cannot come back for the whole summer." "Where are you going then, dear bear?" asked Snow White. "I must go into the forest and guard my treasures from the wicked dwarfs. In the winter, when the earth is frozen hard, they are obliged to stay below and cannot work their way through. But now, when the sun has thawed and warmed the earth, they break through it and come out to pry and steal. And what once gets into their hands and into their caves does not easily see daylight again." Snow White was quite sorry at his departure, and as she unbolted the door for him, and the bear was hurrying out, he caught against the bolt, and a piece of his hairy coat was torn off, and it seemed to Snow White as if she had seen gold shining through it, but she was not so sure about that. The bear ran away quickly and was soon out of sight behind the trees. A short time afterward, the mother sent her children into the forest to get firewood. There, they found a big tree which lay felled on the ground, and close by the trunk something was jumping backwards and forwards in the grass, but they could not make out what it was. When they came nearer, they saw a dwarf with an old wither face and a snow-white beard a yard long. The end of the beard was caught in the crevice of the tree, and the little fellow was jumping about like a dog tied to a rope and did not know what to do. He glared at the girls with his fiery red eyes and cried,
"Why do you stand there? Can you not come here and help me?" "What are you up to, little man?"
asked Rose Red.
"You stupid prying goose,"
answered the dwarf.
"I was going to split the tree to get a little wood for cooking. The little bit of food that we people get is immediately burnt up with heavy logs. We do not swallow as much as you coarse, greedy folk. I had just driven the wedge safely in, and everything was going as I wished, but the cursed wedge was too smooth and suddenly sprang out, and the tree closed so quickly that I could not pull out my beautiful white beard, so now it is tight in, and I cannot get away, and the silly, sleek, milk-faced things laugh. Ah, how odious you are!"
The children tried very hard, but they could not pull the beard out. It was caught too fast.
"I will run and fetch someone,"
said Rose Red.
"You senseless goose,"
snarled the dwarf.
"Why should you fetch someone? You are already too many for me. Can you not think of something better?" "Don't be impatient," said Snow White. "I will help you,"
and she pulled her scissors out of her pocket and cut off the end of the beard. As soon as the dwarf felt himself free, he laid hold of a bag which lay amongst the roots of the tree, and which was full of gold, lifted it up, grumbling to himself,
"Uncouth people, to cut off a piece of my fine beard. Bad luck to you."
And then he swung the bag upon his back and went off without even once looking at the children. Some time afterwards, Snow White and Rose Red went to catch a dish of fish. As they came near the brook, they saw something like a large grasshopper jumping towards the water, as if it were going to leap in. They ran to it and found it was the dwarf.
"Where are you going?" said Rose Red. "You surely don't want to go into the water." "I am not such a fool," cried the dwarf. "Don't you see that the accursed fish wants to pull me in?"
The little man had been sitting there fishing, and unluckily, the wind had tangled up his beard with the fishing line. A moment later, a big fish had made a bite, and the feeble creature had not the strength to pull it out. The fish kept the upper hand and pulled the dwarf towards him. He held on to all the reeds and rushes, but it was of little good, for he was forced to follow the movements of the fish, and was in urgent danger of being dragged into the water. The girls came just in time. They held him fast and tried to free his beard from the line, but all in vain. Beard and line were entangled fast together. There was nothing to do but bring out the scissors and cut the beard, whereby a small part of it was lost. When the dwarf saw that, he screamed out,
"Is that civil, you toadstool, to disfigure a man's face? Was it not enough to clip off the end of my beard? Now you've cut off the best part of it. I cannot let myself be seen by my people. I wish you had been made to run the soles off of your shoes."
Then he took out a sack of pearls which lay in the rushes, and without another word he dragged it away and disappeared behind the stone. It happened that soon afterwards the mother sent the two children to the town to buy needles and thread, and laces and ribbons. The road led them across a heath upon which huge pieces of rock lay strewn about. There they noticed a large bird hovering in the air, flying slowly around and around above them. It sank lower and lower, and at last settled near a rock not far away. Immediately they heard a loud, piteous cry. They ran up and saw with horror that the eagle had seized their old acquaintance the dwarf, and was going to carry him off. The children, full of pity, at once took tight hold of the little man, and pulled against the eagle so long that at last he let his booty go. As soon as the dwarf had recovered from his first fright, he cried with a shrill voice,
Could you not have done it more carefully? You dragged at my brown coat so that it is all torn and full of holes, you clumsy creatures.
Then he took up a sack full of precious stones and slipped away again under the rocks into his hole. The girls, who by this time were used to his ingratitude, went on their way and did their business in the town. As they crossed the heath again on their way home, they surprised the dwarf, who had emptied out his bag of precious stones in a clean spot, and had not thought that anyone would come there so late. The evening sun shone upon the brilliant stones. They glittered and sparkled with all colors so beautifully that the children stood still and stared at them.
"Why do you stand gaping there?"
cried the dwarf, and his ashen-gray face became copper-red with rage. He was still cursing when a loud growling was heard, and a black bear came trotting towards them out of the forest. The dwarf sprang up in a fright, but he could not reach his cave, for the bear was already close. Then, in the dread of his heart, he cried,
"Dear Mr. Bear, spare me. I will give you all of my treasures. Look at the beautiful jewels lying there. Grant me my life. What do you want with such a slender little fellow so as I? You would not feel me between your teeth. Come, take these 2 wicked girls. They are tender morsels for you, fat as young quails. For mercy's sake, please eat them."
The bear took no heed of his words, but gave the wicked creature a single blow with his paw, and the creature did not move again. The girls had run away, but the bear called to them, "Snow White and Rose Red, do not be afraid. Wait, I will come with you." Then they recognized his voice and waited, and when he came up to them, suddenly his bearskin fell off, and he stood there, a handsome man, clothed all in gold. "I am a king's son," he said, "and I was bewitched by that wicked dwarf who had stolen my treasures. I have had to run about the forest as a savage bear until I was freed by his death. Now he has got his well-deserved punishment." Snow White was married to him, and Rose Red to his brother, and they divided between them the great treasure which the dwarf had gathered together in his cave. The old mother lived peacefully and happily with her children for many years. She took the 2 rose trees with her, and they stood before her window, and every year bore the most beautiful roses, white and red. The Glass Coffin. Let no one ever say that a poor tailor cannot do great things and win high honors. All that is needed is that he should go to the right smithy, and what is of most consequence, that he should have good luck. A civil, smart tailor's apprentice once went out traveling, and came into a great forest, and as he did not know the way, he lost himself. Night fell, and nothing was left for him to do in this painful solitude but to seek a bed. He might certainly have found a good bed on the soft moss, but the fear of wild beasts let him have no rest there, and at last he made up his mind to spend the night in a tree. He sought out a high oak, climbed up to the top of it, and thanked God that he had his goose with him, for otherwise the wind which blew over the top of the tree would have carried him away. After he had spent some hours in the darkness, not without fear and trembling, he saw at a very short distance the glimmer of a light, and as he thought that a human habitation might be there, where he would be better off than on the branches of a tree, he got carefully down and went towards the light. It guided him to a small hut that was woven together of reeds and rushes. He knocked boldly, and the door opened, and by the light which came forth he saw a little hoary old man who wore a coat made of bits of colored stuff sewn together. "Who are you, and what do you want?" asked the old man in a grumbling voice. "Well, I am a poor tailor," he answered, "whom night has surprised here in the wilderness, and I earnestly beg you to take me into your hut until morning." "Go your way," replied the old man in a surly voice. "I will have nothing to do with tramps. Seek for yourself a shelter elsewhere." Having said this, he was about to slip into his hut again, but the tailor held him so tightly by the corner of his coat, and pleaded so piteously, that the old man, who was not so ill-natured as he wished to appear, was at last softened, and took him into the hut with him, where he gave him something to eat, and then offered him a very good bed in the corner. The weary tailor needed no rocking, but slept sweetly until morning, but even then would not have thought of getting up, if he had not been aroused by a great noise. A violent sound of screaming and roaring forced its way through the thin walls of the hut. The tailor, full of unwonted courage, jumped up, put his clothes on in haste, and hurried out. Then, close by the hut, he saw a great black bull and a beautiful stag, which were just preparing for a violent struggle. They rushed at each other with such extreme rage that the ground shook with their trampling, and the air resounded with their cries. For a long time it was uncertain which of the two would gain the victory, and at length the stag thrust his horns into the adversary's body, whereupon the bull fell to the earth with a terrific roar and was finished off by the few strokes from the stag. The tailor, who had watched the fight with astonishment, was still standing there motionless when the stag in full career bounded up to him, and before he could escape, caught him up on his great horns. He had not much time to collect his thoughts, for it went in a swift race over stock and stone, mountain and valley, wood and meadow. He held with both hands to the ends of the horns and resigned himself to his fate. It seemed to him just as if he were flying away. At length, the stag stopped in front of a wall of rock and gently let the tailor down. The tailor, more dead than alive, required some time to come to himself. When he had in some degree recovered, the stag, which remained standing by him, pushed its horns with such force against a door in the rock that it sprang open. Flames of fire shot forth, after which followed a great smoke, which hid the stag from his sight. The tailor did not know what to do or whither to turn in order to get out of this desert and back to human beings again. Whilst he was standing thus undecided, a voice sounded out of the rock which cried to him, "Enter without fear. No evil shall befall you." He hesitated, but driven by a mysterious force, he obeyed the voice and went through the iron door into a large, spacious hall, whose ceiling, walls, and floors were made of shining, polished square stones, on each of which were carved signs which were unknown to him. He looked at everything full of admiration, and was on the point of going out again, when he once more heard the voice which said to him, "Step on the stone which lies in the middle of the hall, and great good fortune awaits you." His courage had already grown so great that he obeyed the order. The stone began to give way under his feet and sank slowly down into the depths. When it was once more firm and the tailor looked around, he found himself in a hall which in size resembled the former. Here, however, there was more to look at and more to admire. Hollow places were cut into the walls, in which stood vases of transparent glass and filled with colored spirit or with a bluish vapor. On the floor of the hall, two great glass chests stood opposite of each other, which at once excited his curiosity. When he went to one of them, he saw inside it a handsome structure like a castle surrounded by farm buildings, stables and barns, and a quantity of other good things. Everything was small, but exceedingly carefully and delicately made, and seemed to be carved out by a dexterous hand with the greatest precision. He might not have turned away his eye from the consideration of this rarity for some time, had not the voice once more made itself heard. It ordered him to turn around and look at the glass chest which was standing opposite. How his admiration increased when he saw therein a maiden of the greatest beauty. She lay as if asleep, and was wrapped in her long fair hair as in a precious mantle. Her eyes were closely shut, but the brightness of her complexion, and a ribbon which her breathing moved to and fro, left no doubt that she was alive. The tailor was looking at the beauty with a beating heart, and she suddenly opened her eyes and stared up at the sight of him with a shock of joy.
"Divine Providence!" cried she. "My deliverance is at hand. Quick, quick, help me out of my prison. If you push back the bolt of this glass coffin, then I shall be free."
The tailor obeyed without delay, and she immediately raised up the glass lid, came out, and hastened into the corner of the hall, where she covered herself with a large cloak. Then she seated herself on a stone, ordered the young man to come to her, and after she had imprinted a friendly kiss on his lips, she said,
"My long-desired deliverer, kind heaven has guided you to me and put an end to my sorrows. On the self-same day when they end shall your happiness begin. You are the husband chosen from me by heaven, and shall pass your life in unbroken joy, loved by me, and rich to overflowing in every earthly possession. Seat yourself and listen to the story of my life. I am the daughter of a rich count. My parents died when I was still in my tender youth, and recommended me in their last will to my elder brother, by whom I was brought up. We loved each other so tenderly, and were so alike in our way of thinking and our inclinations, that we both embraced the resolution never to marry, but to stay together to the end of our lives. In our house there was no lack of company. Neighbors and friends visited us often, and we showed the greatest hospitality to everyone. So it came to pass one evening that a stranger came riding to our castle, and under pretext of not being able to get on to the next place, begged for shelter for the night. We granted his request with ready courtesy, and he entertained us in the most agreeable manner during supper by conversation intermingled with stories. My brother liked the stranger so much that he begged him to spend a couple of days with us, to which, after some hesitation, he consented. We did not rise from table until late in the night. The stranger was shown to a room, and I hastened, as I was tired, to lay my limbs in my soft bed. Hardly had I fallen off to sleep when the sound of faint and delightful music awoke me. As I could not conceive from whence it came, I wanted to summon my waiting maid, who slept in the next room, but to my astonishment I found that speech was taken away from me by an unknown force. I felt as if a nightmare were weighing down my breast, and I was unable to make the very slightest sound. In the meantime, by the light of the night lamp, I saw the stranger enter my room through 2 doors which were fast bolted. He came to me and said that by magic arts which were at his command he had caused the lovely music to sound in order to awaken me, and that he now forced his way through all fastenings with the intention of offering his hand and heart. My dislike of his magic arts was so great, however, that I refused to answer him. He remained for a time standing without moving, apparently with the idea of waiting for a favorable decision, but as I continued to keep silence, he angrily declared that he would revenge himself and find a means to punish my pride, and then he left the room. I passed the night in the greatest disquietude, and fell asleep only towards morning. And when I awoke, I hurried to my brother, but did not find him in his room, and the attendants told me that he had ridden forth with the stranger to chase at daybreak. I at once suspected nothing good. I dressed myself quickly, ordered my palfrey to be saddled, and accompanied only by one servant, rode full gallop to the forest. The servant fell with his horse and could not follow me, for the horse had broken its foot. I pursued my way without halting, and in a few minutes I saw the stranger coming towards me with a beautiful stag which he led by a cord. I asked him where he had left my brother, and how he had come by this stag, out of whose great eyes I saw tears flowing. Instead of answering me, he began to laugh loudly. I fell into a great rage at this, pulled out a pistol, and discharged it at the monster, but the ball rebounded from his breast and went right into my horse's head. I fell to the ground, and the stranger muttered some words which deprived me of consciousness. When I came to my senses again, I found myself in this underground cave in a glass coffin. The magician appeared once again, and said that he had changed my brother into a stag, changed my castle with all that belonged to it, diminished in size by his arts. He had shut up in the other glass chest, and my people, who were all turned into smoke, he had confined in glass bottles. He told me that if I would now comply with his wish, that it would be an easy thing for him to put everything back in its former state, as he had nothing to do but open the vessels, and everything would return once more to its natural form. I answered him as little as I had done the first time. He vanished and left me in my prison, in which a deep sleep came on. Among the visions which passed before my eyes, the most comforting was that in which a young man came and set me free. And when I opened my eyes today, I saw you and beheld my dream fulfilled. Help me to accomplish the other things which happened in those visions. The first is that we lift the glass chest in which my castle is enclosed onto that broad stone.
As soon as the stone was laden, it began to rise up on high with the maiden and the young man, and mounted through the opening of the ceiling into the upper hall, from whence they could easily reach the open air. Here the maiden opened the lid, and it was marvelous to behold how the castle, the houses, and the farm buildings which were enclosed stretched themselves out and grew to their natural size with the greatest rapidity. After this, the maiden and the tailor returned to the cave beneath the earth, and had the vessels which were filled with smoke carried up by the stone. The maiden had scarcely opened the bottles when the blue smoke rushed out and changed itself into living men, in whom she recognized her servants and her people. Her joy was still more increased when her brother, who had killed the magician in the form of a bull, came out of the forest towards them in his human form. And on the selfsame day the maiden, in accordance with her promise, gave her hand at the altar to the lucky tailor. Lazy Harry. Harry was lazy, and although he had nothing else to do but drive his goat daily to pasture, he nevertheless groaned when he went home after his day's work was done. "It is indeed a heavy burden," said he, "and a wearisome employment to drive a goat into the field this way year after year, till late into the autumn. If one could but lie down and sleep, but no, one must have one's eyes open lest the goat hurts the young trees, or squeezes itself through a hedge into the garden, or runs away altogether. How can one have any rest, or enjoy one's life?" He seated himself, collected his thoughts, and considered how he could set his shoulders free from this burden. For a long time all thinking was to no purpose, but suddenly it was as if scales fell from his eyes. "I know what I will do," he cried. "I will marry Fat Trina, who is also a goat, and can take mine out with hers, and then I shall have no more need to trouble myself." So Harry got up, set his weary legs in motion, and went right across the street, for it was no farther, to where the parents of Fat Trina lived, and asked for their industrious and virtuous daughter in marriage. The parents did not reflect long. Birds of a feather flocked together, they thought, and consented. So Fat Trina became Harry's wife, and led out both the goats. Harry had a good time of it, and had no work that he was required to rest from but his own idleness. He went out with her only now and then, and said, "I merely do it that I may afterwards enjoy rest more. Otherwise, one loses all feeling for it." But Fat Trina was no less idle. "Dear Harry," she said one day, "why should we make our lives so toilsome when there is no need for it, and thus ruin the best days of our youth? Would it not be better for us to give the 2 goats which disturb us every morning in our sweetest sleep with their bleating to our neighbor, and he will give us a beehive for them? We will put the beehive in a sunny place behind the house, and trouble ourselves no more about it. Bees do not require to be taken care of or driven into the field. They fly out and find the way home again for themselves, and collect honey without giving the very least trouble." "You've spoken like a sensible woman," replied Harry. "We will carry out your proposal without delay, and besides all that, honey tastes better and nourishes one better than goat's milk, and it can be kept longer too." The neighbor willingly gave a beehive for the 2 goats, The bees flew in and out from early morning until late evening without ever tiring, and filled the hive with the most beautiful honey, so that in autumn Harry was able to take a whole pitcher full out of it. They placed the jug on the board which was fixed to the wall of their bedroom, and as they were afraid that it might be stolen, or that the mice might find it, Trina brought in a stout hazel stick and put it beside her bed, so that without unnecessary motion she might reach it with her hand and drive away the uninvited guests. Lazy Harry did not like to leave his bed before noon. "He who rises early," said he, "wastes his substance." One morning when he was still lying amongst the feathers in broad daylight, resting after his long sleep, he said to his wife, "Women are fond of sweet things, and you are always tasting the honey in private. It will be better for us to exchange it for a goose with a young gosling before you eat up the whole lot of it."
"But,"
answered Trina,
"not before we have a child to take care of them. Am I to worry myself with the little geese and spend all of my strength on them to no purpose?"
"Do you think," said Harry, "that the youngster will look after geese? Nowadays children no longer obey. They do according to their own fancy, because they consider themselves cleverer than their parents, just like that lad who was sent to seek the cow and chase 3 blackbirds.
"Oh,"
replied Tina,
"this one shall fare badly if he does not do what I say. I will take a stick and belabor his skin with more blows than I can count. Look, Harry,"
cried she in her zeal, and seized the stick with which she used to drive the mice away.
"look, this is the way I will fall on him."
She reached her arm out to strike, but unhappily hit the honey pitcher above the bed. The pitcher struck against the wall and fell down in shards, and the fine honey streamed out onto the ground. "There lie the goose and the young gosling," said Harry, "and want no looking after, but it is lucky that the pitcher did not fall on my head. We have all reason to be satisfied with our lot." And then, as he saw that there was still some honey in one of the shards, he stretched out his hand for it and said quite gaily, "The remains, my wife. We will still eat with relish, and we will rest a little after the fright we have had. What does it matter if we do get up a little later? The day is always long enough."
"Yes,"
answered Trina,
"we shall always get to the end of it at the proper time."
"You know, the snail was once asked to a wedding and set out to go, but arrived at the christening. In front of the house it fell over the fence and said, 'Speed does no good.'" The Griffin. There was once upon a time a king, but where he reigned and what he was called I do not know. He had no son, but only a daughter who had always been ill, and no doctor had been able to cure her. Then it was foretold to the king that his daughter would find her health by eating an apple, so he ordered it to be proclaimed throughout the whole of his kingdom that whosoever brought his daughter an apple with which she could find her health should have her to wife, and then become king. This became known to a peasant who had 3 sons, and he said to the eldest, "Go out into the garden and take a basketful of those beautiful apples with the red cheeks, and carry them to the court. Perhaps the king's daughter will be able to find her health with them, and then you will marry her and be king." The lad did so, and set out. When he had gone a short way, he met a hoary little man who asked him what he had there in the basket, to which replied Yuli, for so was he named, "Frog's legs." At this the little man said,
"Well, so shall it be, and remain."
and he went away. At length Yuli arrived at the palace, and made it known that he had brought apples which would cure the king's daughter if she ate them. This delighted the king hugely, and he caused Yuli to be brought before him, but, alas, when he opened the basket, instead of having apples in it, he had frog's legs, which were still kicking about. On this, the king grew angry, and had him driven out of the house. When he got home, he told his father how it had fared with him. Then the father sent his next son, who was called Same, but all went with him just as it had gone with Yuli. He also met the hoary little man, who asked what he had there in the basket. Same said, hog's bristles. And the hoary man said,
Well, so shall it be, and remain.
When Sam got to the king's palace and said he brought apples with him which the king's daughter might find her health, they did not want to let him go in, and said that one fellow had already been there and had treated them as if they were fools. Sam, however, maintained that he certainly had the apples, and that they ought to let him go in. At length they believed him, and led him to the king, but when he uncovered the basket, he had but hog's bristles. This enraged the king most terribly, so he caused Sam to be whipped out of the house. When he got home, he recalled all that had befallen him, whereupon the youngest boy, whose name was Hans, but who was always called Stupid Hans, came and asked his father if he might go with some apples.
"Oh," said the father, "you would just be the right fellow for such a thing. If the clever one can't manage it, what can you do?"
The boy, however, insisted and said,
"Indeed, father, I wish to go." "Just get away, you stupid fellow. You must wait until you are wiser,"
said the father to that, and he turned his back. Hans, however, pulled at the back of the smock and said,
Indeed, father, I wish to go.
"Well then, so far as I am concerned, you may go, but you will soon come home again,"
replied the old man in a spiteful voice. The boy was tremendously delighted and jumped for joy. Well, acted like a fool.
"You grow more stupid every day,"
said the father again. But Hans was not discouraged, and he did not let it spoil his pleasure. But as it was the night, he thought he might well wait until the morrow, for he could not get to court that day. All night long he could not sleep in his bed, and if he did doze for a moment, he dreamt of beautiful maidens, of palaces, of gold, and of silver, and all kinds of things of that sort. Early in the morning he went forth on his way, and directly afterwards the little shabby-looking man in his icy clothes came to him and asked what he was carrying in the basket. Hans gave him the answer that he was carrying apples, with which the king's daughter was to find her health.
Then, said the little man, so shall they be, and remain.
But at the court, they would none of them let Hans go in, for they said 2 had already been there who had told him that they were bringing apples, and one of them had brought frog's legs, and the other hog's bristles. Hans, however, resolutely maintained that he most certainly had no frog's legs, but some of the most beautiful apples in the whole kingdom. As he spoke so pleasantly, the doorkeeper thought he could not be telling a lie, and he asked him to go in, and he was right, for when Hans uncovered his basket in the king's presence, golden yellow apples came tumbling out. The king was delighted and caused some of them to be taken to his daughter, and then waited in anxious expectation until news should be brought to him of the effect that they had had. But before much time had passed, news was brought to him, and who do you think it was who came? It was the daughter herself. As soon as she had eaten one of those apples, she was cured, and sprang out of her bed. The joy the king felt cannot be described. But now he did not want to give his daughter in marriage to Hans, and he said that he must first make him a boat which would go quicker on dry land than on water. Hans agreed to the condition, and went home and related how it had fared with him. Then the father sent Yuli into the forest to make a boat of that kind. He worked diligently and whistled all the time. At midday, when the sun was at its highest, came the little icy man and asked what he was making. Yuli gave him for answer, wooden bowls for the kitchen. The icy man said,
So it shall be, and remain.
By evening, Yuli thought he had now made the boat, but when he wanted to get into it, he had nothing but wooden bowls. The next day, Sam went into the forest, but everything went with him just as it had done with Yuli. On the third day, Stupid Hans went. He worked away most industriously, so that the whole forest resounded with the heavy blows, and all the while he sang and whistled right merrily. At midday, when it was the hottest, the little man came again, and asked what he was making.
A boat which will go quicker on dry land than on water, replied Hans, and when I have finished it, I am to have the king's daughter for my wife. Well, said the little man, such an one shall it be, and remain.
In the evening, when the sun had turned into gold, Hans finished his boat, and all that was wanted for it. He got into it and rowed to the palace. The boat went as swiftly as the wind. The king saw it from afar, but would not give his daughter to Hans yet, and said he must first take 100 hares out to pasture from early morning until late evening, and if one of them got away, he should not have his daughter. Hans was contented with this, and the next day went with his flock to the pasture, and took great care that none of them ran away. Before many hours had passed came a servant from the palace, and he told Hans that he must give her a hare instantly, for some visitors had come unexpectedly. Hans, however, was very well aware what that meant, and said he would not give one to her. The king might set some hare soup before his guests the next day. The maid, however, would not accept his refusal, and at last she began to argue with him. Then Hans said that if the king's daughter came herself, he would give her a fare. The maid told this in the palace, and the daughter did go herself. In the meantime, the little man came again to Hans, and asked him what he was doing there. Hans said he had to watch over 100 hares to see that none of them ran away, and then he might marry the king's daughter and become a king.
"Good," said the little man. "There is a whistle for you, and if one of them runs away, just whistle with it, and then it will come back again."
When the king's daughter came, Hans gave her a hare into her apron, but when she had gone about 100 steps with it, he whistled, and the hare jumped out of the apron, and before she could turn around, the hare was back to the flock again. When the evening came, the hare herd whistled once more, and looked to see if all were there, and then drove them to the palace. The king wondered how Hans had been able to take 100 hares to graze without losing any of them, but he still would not give him his daughter yet, and he said he must now bring him a feather from the griffin's tail. Hans set out at once and walked straight forwards. In the evening he came to a castle, and there he asked for a night's lodging, for at that time there were no inns. The lord of the castle promised him that with much pleasure, and asked where he was going. Hans answered,
"To the Griffin."
"Oh, to the Griffin. They tell me he knows everything, and I have lost the key of an iron money chest, so you might be so good as to ask him where it is."
"Yes, indeed," said Hans. "I will do that."
Early next morning he went onwards, and on his way he arrived at another castle in which he again stayed the night. When the people who lived there learnt that he was going to the Griffin, they said they had in the house a daughter who was ill, and that they had already tried every means to cure her, but none of them had done her any good, and he might be so kind as to ask the Griffin what would make their daughter healthy again. Hans said he would willingly do that, and went onwards. Then he came to a lake, and instead of a ferry boat, a tall man was there who had to carry everybody across. The man asked Hans whither he was journeying.
"To the Griffin,"
said Hans.
"Then, when you get to him," said the man, "just ask him why I am forced to carry everybody over the lake."
"Yes, indeed. Most certainly I'll do that,"
said Hans. Then the man took him up on his shoulders and carried him across the lake. At length Hans arrived at the Griffin's house, but the wife only was at home, and not the Griffin himself. When the woman asked him what he wanted, thereupon he told her everything, that he had to get a feather out of the Griffin's tail, and that there was a castle where they had lost the key of their money chest, and he was asked the Griffin where it was, and in another castle the daughter was ill, and he was to learn what would cure her, and then, not far from thence, there was a lake and a man beside it, who was forced to carry people across it, and he was very anxious to learn why the man was obliged to do it. Then said the woman,
"Look here, my good friend. No Christian can speak to the Griffin. He devours them all. But if you like, you can lie down under his bed, and in the night, when he is quite fast asleep, you can reach out and pull a feather out of his tail. And as for those things which you are to learn, I will ask about them myself."
Hans was quite satisfied with this, and got under the bed. In the evening the Griffin came home, and as soon as he entered the room, said,
"Wife, I smell a Christian."
"Yes," said the woman. "One was here today, but he went away again."
And on that the Griffin said no more. In the middle of the night, when the Griffin was snoring loudly, Hans reached out and plucked a feather from his tail. The Griffin woke up instantly and said,
"Wife, I smell a Christian, and it seems to me that somebody was pulling at my tail."
His wife said,
"You have certainly been dreaming, and I told you before that a Christian was here today, but that he went away again. He told me all kinds of things, that in one castle they had lost the key of their money chest and could find it nowhere."
"Oh, fools," said the Griffin. "The key lies in the woodhouse under a log of wood behind the door."
And then he said that in another castle the daughter was ill, and they knew no remedy that would cure her.
"Oh, the fools," said the Griffin. "Under the cellar steps a toad has made its nest of her hair, and if she got her hair back she should be well."
And then he also said that there was a place where there was a lake and a man beside it who was forced to carry everybody across.
"Oh, the fool,"
said the Griffin.
"If he only put one man down in the middle, he would never have to carry another across."
Early the next morning, the Griffin got up and went out. Then Hans came forth from under the bed, and he had a beautiful feather, and had heard what the Griffin had said about the key, and the daughter, and the man. The Griffin's wife repeated it all once more to him that he might not forget it, and then he went home again. First he came to the man by the lake, who asked him what the Griffin had said, but Hans replied that he must first carry him across, and then he would tell him. So the man carried him across, and when he was over, Hans told him that all he had to do was to set one person down in the middle of the lake, and then he would never have to carry over any more. The man was hugely delighted, and told Hans that out of gratitude he would take him once more across and back again, but Hans said no, he would save him the trouble. He was quite satisfied already, and pursued his way. Then he came to the castle where the daughter was ill. He took her on his shoulders, for she could not walk, and he carried her down the cellar steps and pulled out the toad's nest from beneath the lowest step and gave it into her hand, and she sprang off of his shoulder and up the steps before him and was quite cured. Then were the father and mother beyond measure rejoiced, and they gave Hans gifts of gold and silver, and whatsoever else he wished for, they gave him. And when he got to the other castle, he went at once into the wood house, and found the key under the log of wood behind the door, and took it to the lord of the castle. He was not a little pleased, and gave Hans as a reward much of the gold that was in the chest, and all kinds of things besides, such as cows and sheep and goats. When Hans arrived before the king with all of these things, with the money, the gold, the silver, the cows, the sheep, and the goats, the king asked him how he had come by them. Then Hans told him that the Griffin gave everyone whatsoever he wanted. So the king thought he himself could make use of such things, and he set out on his way to the Griffin. But when he got to the lake, it happened that he was the very first who arrived there after Hans, and the man put him down in the middle of it and went away, and the king was drowned. Hans, however, married the daughter and became the new king. Strong Hans. There was once a man and a woman who had an only child, and lived quite alone in a solitary valley. It came to pass that the mother once went into the wood to gather branches of fir, and took with her little Hans, who was just 2 years old. As it was springtime, and the child took pleasure in the many-colored flowers, she went still further onwards with him into the forest. Suddenly, 2 robbers sprang out of the thicket, seized the mother and child, and carried them far away into the black forest, where no one ever came from one year's end to another. The poor woman urgently begged the robbers to set her and her child free, but their hearts were made of stone, and they would not listen to her prayers and entreaties, and they drove her on farther by force. After they had worked their way through bushes and briars for about 2 miles, they came to a rock where there was a door, at which the robbers knocked, and it opened at once. They had to go through a long dark passage, which burnt on the hearth. On the wall hung swords, sabers, and other deadly weapons which gleamed in the light, and in the midst stood a black table at which 4 other robbers were sitting and gambling, and the captain sat at the head of it. As soon as he saw the woman, he came and spoke to her, and he told her to be at ease and have no fear. They would do nothing to hurt her, but she must look after the housekeeping, and if she kept everything in order, she should not fare ill with them. Thereupon they gave her something to eat, and showed her a bed where she might sleep with her child. The woman stayed many years with the robbers, and Hans grew tall and strong. His mother told him stories, and taught him to read an old book of tales about knights which she found in the cave. When Hans was 9 years old, he made himself a strong club out of a branch of fir, hid it behind the bed, and then went to his mother and said,
"Dear mother, pray tell me who is my father. I must and will know."
His mother was silent and would not tell him, that he might not become homesick. Moreover, she knew that the godless robbers would not let him go away, but it almost broke her heart that Hans should not go to his father. In the night, when the robbers came home from their robbing expedition, Hans brought out his club, stood before the captain, and said,
"I now wish to know who my father is, and if you do not tell me at once, I will strike you down."
Then the captain laughed and gave Hans such a box on the ear that he rolled under a table. Hans got up again, held his tongue, and thought,
"I will wait another year and then try again. Perhaps I shall do better then."
When that year was over, he brought out his club again, rubbed the dust off of it, looked at it well, and said,
"It is a strong, stout club."
At night, the robbers came home, drank one jug of wine after another, and their heads began to be heavy. Then Hans brought out his club, placed himself before the captain, and he asked him who his father was. But the captain again gave him such a vigorous box on the ear that Hans rolled under the table. However, it was not long before he was up again, and so beat the captain and the robbers with his club that they could no longer move either their arms or their legs. His mother stood in the corner, full of admiration for his bravery and strength. When Hans had done his work, he went to his mother and said,
"Now I have shown myself to be in earnest, but now I must also know who my father is." "Dear Hans,"
answered the mother,
"come, we will go and seek him until we find him."
She took from the captain the key to the entrance door, and Hans fetched a great meal sack and packed into it gold and silver and whatsoever else he could find that was beautiful, until it was full, and then he took it on his back. They left the cave, but how Hans did open his eyes when he came out of the darkness into daylight and saw the green forest and the flowers and the birds and the morning sun in the sky. He stood there and wondered at everything, just as if he were not quite right in the head. His mother looked for the way home, and when they had walked for a couple of hours, they got safely into their lonely valley and to their little house. The father was sitting in the doorway. He wept for joy when he recognized his wife and heard that Hans was his son, for he had long regarded them both as dead. But Hans, although he was not 12 years old, was a head taller than his father. They went into the little room together, but Hans had scarcely put his sack on the bench by the stove than the whole house began to crack. The bench broke down and even the floor, and the heavy sack fell through into the cellar.
"God save us!"
cried the father.
"What's that? Now you have broken our little house to pieces."
"Don't let that turn your hair gray, dear father," answered Hans. "There, in that sack, is more than is wanting for a new house."
The father and Hans at once began to build a new house, to buy cattle and land, and to keep a farm. Hans plowed the fields, and when he followed the plow and pushed it into the ground, the bullocks had scarcely any need to draw. The next spring, Hans said,
"Keep all the money and have made for me a walking stick that weighs 100 weight, that I may go a-traveling."
When the stick was ready, he left his father's house, went forth, and came to a deep, dark forest. There he heard something crunching and cracking, looked round, and saw a fir tree which was wound round like a rope from the bottom to the top, and when he looked upwards, he saw a great fellow who had laid hold of the tree and was twisting it like a willow wand.
"Hello!" cried Hans. "What are you doing up there?"
The fellow replied,
"I got some bundles together yesterday, and am twisting a rope for them."
"Well, that is what I like," thought Hans. "He has some strength." And he called to him, "Leave that alone, and come with me." The fellow came down, and he was taller by a whole head than Hans, and Hans was not little.
"Your name is now Fur Twister," said Hans to him.
Therefore they went further and heard something knocking and hammering with such force that the ground shook at every stroke. Shortly afterwards they came to a mighty rock, before which a giant was standing and striking great pieces of it away with his fist. When Hans asked what he was doing, he answered,
"At night, when I want to sleep, bears, wolves, and other kind of vermin that come, which sniff and snuffle about me, and won't let me rest. So I want to build myself a house, and lay myself inside of it, so that I may have some peace."
"Oh, indeed," thought Hans, "I can make use of this one also." And he said to him, "Leave your house building alone, and go with me. You shall be called Rock Splitter." The man consented, and they all three roamed through the forest, and wherever they went, the wild beasts were terrified and ran away from them. In the evening they came to an old deserted castle, went up into it, and laid themselves down in the hall to sleep. The next morning Hans went into the garden. It had run quite wild and was full of thorns and brambles, and as he was thus walking round about, a wild boar rushed at him. He, however, gave it such a blow with his club that it fell directly. He took it on his shoulders and carried it in, and they put it on a spit, roasted it, and enjoyed themselves. Then they arranged that each day, in turn, 2 should go out hunting, and 1 should stay at home and cook 9 pounds of meat for each of them. Fur Twister stayed at home the first, and Hans and Rock Splitter went out hunting. When Fur Twister was busy cooking, a little shriveled-up old mannikin came to him in the castle and asked for some meat.
"Be off, you sneaking imp," he answered. "You need no meat."
But how astonished Fur Twister was when the little insignificant dwarf sprang up at him and belabored him so with his fists that he could not defend himself, but fell on the ground and gasped for breath. The dwarf did not go away until he had thoroughly vented his anger on him. When the 2 others came home from hunting, Fur Twister said nothing to them of the old mannikin and of the blows which he had himself received, and thought,
"When they stay at home, they may just try their chance with a little scrubbing brush."
and the mere thought of that gave him pleasure already. The next day, Rock Splitter stayed home, and he fared just as Fur Twister had done, being very ill-treated by the dwarf, because he was not willing to give him any meat. When the others came home in the evening, Fur Twister saw clearly what he had suffered, but both kept silence and thought, Hans also must taste some of that soup. Hans, who was to stay at home the next day, did his work in the kitchen as it had to be done, and as he was standing, skimming the pan, the dwarf came and without more ado, demanded a piece of meat. Then Hans thought, he is a poor wretch. I will give him some of my share, that the others may not run short, and he handed the mannikin a bit of meat. When the dwarf had devoured it, he again asked for some meat, and good-natured Hans gave it to him, and told him it was a handsome piece, and that he was to be content with it. But the dwarf begged again for the 3rd time. You are shameless, said Hans, and he gave him none. Then the malicious dwarf wanted to spring on him, and treat him as he had treated the Fur Twister and Rock Splitter, but he had chosen the wrong man. Hans, without exerting himself much, gave him a couple of blows which made him jump down the castle steps. Hans was about to run after him, but fell right over, flat on his face. When he rose up again, the dwarf had got the start of him. Hans hurried after him as far as the forest, but saw him slip into a hole in the rock. Hans now went home, but he had marked the spot. When the 2 others came back, they were surprised that Hans was so well. He told them what had happened, and then they no longer concealed how it had fared with them. Hans laughed and said,
"It served you quite right. Why were you so mean with your meat? It is a disgrace that you who are so big should have let yourselves be beaten by a dwarf."
Thereupon they took a basket and a rope, and all three went to the hole in the rock into which the dwarf had slipped, and they let Hans and his club down in the basket. When Hans had reached the bottom, he found a door, and when he opened it, a maiden was sitting there, who was lovely as any picture, nay, so beautiful that no words can express it, and by her side sat a dwarf, and grinned at Hans like a sea cat. She, however, was bound with chains, and looked so mournfully at him that Hans felt a great pity for her, and he thought to himself,
"You must deliver her out of the power of the wicked dwarf."
And he gave the dwarf such a blow with his club that he fell down dead. Immediately the chains fell from the maiden, and Hans was enraptured with her beauty. She told him she was a king's daughter, whom a savage count had stolen away from her home, and imprisoned her there among the rocks, because she would have nothing to say to him. The count, however, had set the dwarf as a watchman, and he had made her suffer misery and vexation enough. And now Hans placed the maiden in the basket and had her drawn up. The basket came down again, but Hans did not trust his two companions and thought,
"They have already shown themselves to be false, and told me nothing about the dwarf. Who knows what design they may have against me?"
So he put his club in the basket, and it was lucky he did, for when the basket was halfway up, they let it fall again, and if Hans had really been sitting in it, he would have been killed. But now he did not know how he was to work his way out of the depths, and when he turned it over and over in his mind, he found no counsel.
"It is indeed sad," he said to himself, "that I have to waste away down here."
And as he was thus walking backwards and forwards, he once more came to the little chamber where the maiden had been sitting, and saw that the dwarf had a ring on his finger, which shone and sparkled. He then drew it off and put it on, and when he turned it around on his finger, he suddenly heard something rustle over his head. He looked up and saw spirits of the air hovering above, who told him he was their master, and asked what his desire might be. Hans was at first struck dumb, but afterwards he said that they were to carry him up again. They obeyed instantly, and it was just as if he had flown up himself, but when he had arrived there, he found no one in sight. For Twister and Rock Splitter had hurried away and had taken the beautiful maiden with them. Hans turned the ring, and the spirits of the air came and told him that the two were on the sea. Hans ran and ran without stopping until he came to the seashore, and there, far, far out on the water, he perceived a little boat in which his faithless comrades were sitting, and in fierce anger he leapt, without thinking what he was doing, club in hand, into the water, and he began to swim. But the club, which weighed 100 weight, dragged him deep down until he was all but drowned. Then, in the very nick of time, he turned his ring, and immediately the spirits of the air came and bore him as swift as lightning into the boat. He swung his club and gave his wicked comrades the reward that they merited, and he threw them into the water, and then he sailed with the beautiful maiden who had been in the greatest alarm, and whom he delivered for the second time home to her father and mother. And he married her, and all rejoiced exceedingly. Eve's various children. When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, they were compelled to build a house for themselves on barren ground and eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. Adam dug up the land, and Eve spun. Every year Eve brought a child into the world, but the children were unlike each other, some pretty and some ugly. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he was coming to inspect their household. Eve, delighted that the Lord should be so gracious, cleaned her house diligently, decked it with flowers, and strewed rushes on the floor. Then she brought in her children, but only the beautiful ones. She washed and bathed them, combed their hair, put clean raiment on them, and cautioned them to conduct themselves decorously and modestly in the presence of their lord. They were to bow down before him civilly, hold out their hands, and to answer his questions modestly and sensibly. The ugly children, however, were not to let themselves be seen. One hid himself beneath the hay, another under the roof, a third in the straw, the fourth in the stove, the fifth in the cellar, the sixth under a tub, the seventh beneath the wine cask, the eighth under an old fur cloak, the ninth and 10th beneath a cloth out of which she always made their old clothes, and the 11th and 12th under the leather out of which she cut their shoes. She had scarcely got ready before there was a knock at the house door. Adam looked through the chink and saw that it was the Lord. Adam opened the door respectfully, and the Heavenly Father entered. There, in a row, stood the pretty children, and bowed before him, held out their hands, and knelt down. The Lord, however, began to bless them, laid his hands on the first, and said,
"Thou shalt be a powerful king."
And to the second,
"Thou a prince."
to the third,
"Thou a count."
to the fourth,
"Thou a knight."
to the fifth,
"Thou a nobleman."
to the sixth,
"Thou a burgher."
to the seventh,
"Thou a merchant."
and to the eighth,
"Thou a learned man."
he bestowed upon them also his richest blessings. When Eve saw that the Lord was so mild and gracious, she thought,
I will bring hither my ill-favored children also. It may be that he will bestow his blessing on them likewise.
So she ran and brought them out of the hay, the straw, the stove, and wherever else she had concealed them. Then came the whole coarse, dirty, scabby, sooty band. The Lord smiled, looked at them all, and said,
"I will bless these also."
He laid his hands on the first and said to him,
"Thou shalt be a peasant."
to the second,
"Thou a fisherman."
to the third,
"Thou a smith."
to the fourth,
"Thou a tanner."
to the fifth,
"Thou a weaver."
to the sixth,
"Thou'st a shoemaker."
to the seventh,
"Thou a tailor."
to the eighth,
"Thou a potter."
to the ninth,
"Thou a wagoner."
to the 10th,
"Thou a sailor."
to the 11th,
"Thou a messenger."
to the 12th,
"Thou a scullion all the days of thy life."
When Eve had heard all of this, she said,
Lord, how unequally thou dividest thy gifts. After all, they are all of them my children, whom I have brought into the world. Thy favor should be given to all alike.
But God answered,
"Eve, thou dost not understand. It is right and necessary that the entire world should be supplied from thy children. If they were all princes and lords, who would grow corn, thresh it, grind and bake it? Who would be blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, masons, laborers, tailors, and seamstresses? Each shall have his own place, so that one shall support the other, and all shall be fed like the limbs of one body."
Then Eve answered,
Oh, Lord, forgive me. I was too quick in speaking to thee. Have thy divine will with my children.
Thank you all again for sitting along with us for this session of Grimm's Fairy Tales. Hope you all enjoyed this. Please let your friends know if you've enjoyed this. Like, share, and subscribe. Please come back next time. And until we see you again, sweet dreams.